The day I received a certified letter from my local Homeowners Association, I initially assumed it would be some petty complaint about my mailbox not matching the designated shade of taupe, but I soon discovered this was a far more absurd and infuriating matter altogether. The letter detailed how my so-called excessive breathing was disruptive to the harmonious peace of the neighborhood, alleging that my late-night gasps for air were somehow echoing across property lines and disturbing the other residents. At first, I nearly laughed myself into a coughing fit, because in all my years of living, I'd never been told I could possibly be fined for engaging in the most basic function of human existence. Yet the more I read, the more appalled I became, for the HOA's arrogant chairwoman, an iron-fisted dictator named Beverly Storm, had printed out bullet-pointed guidelines defining what decibel level was acceptable for personal respiration. I muttered, "What the hell?" under my breath at least a dozen times as I realized that Beverly had included an actual decibel chart, apparently believing she had the authority to issue a formal directive on how I should inhale and exhale in the privacy of my own damn home. The letter went on to threaten a $150 fine for every documented instance of my breathing registering above an arbitrary volume threshold, to be measured by some ridiculous contraption they'd installed near my fence line. As I sat there with the paper in my hand, eyes darting back and forth between the insane text and the HOA seal embossed at the top, I had to remind myself this was not some twisted prank but a real notice from the same group that usually whined about grass length and holiday decorations. My frustration skyrocketed when I read the final paragraph, which stated that after 3 such citations, the HOA reserved the right to take me to a mandatory community compliance training, presumably some Orwellian re-education seminar where I'd learn how to be a quieter, more obedient neighbor. Even though I knew Beverly's sense of authority was more bloated than a balloon in a hot car, I genuinely couldn't believe we'd arrived at a point where a neighbor's bodily function was regulated. After taking a few minutes to gather my composure, I decided to walk down the street and personally confront Beverly at her fortress of meddling, a pristine beige house that practically screamed self-righteousness. She met me on her immaculate front porch, arms crossed and nose in the air, as though I were a disobedient child tracked mud into her pristine domain. "Good afternoon, Miss Storm," I said, trying my best not to let my anger show immediately. "I got your letter about my so-called excessive breathing, and I have to say this must be some kind of joke." She didn't even flinch, just tapped her foot and said, "Mr. Jameson, rules are rules, and your nightly noises have been measured and recorded. The entire community deserves peace." I try not to scoff as I told her I'd never heard of a decibel limit on breathing, but she promptly whipped out a clipboard with typed-out references to bogus covenants and restrictions, citing a made-up clause that seemed more like a creative writing exercise than any legitimate rule. When I asked her who else in the HOA leadership had approved this insanity, she cleared her throat and explained that she herself had unilaterally approved the rule under some emergency clause about health and wellness disturbances. As my blood pressure soared, I realized Beverly was orchestrating some personal vendetta. I recalled how a few weeks earlier, I'd been the only neighbor who voted against her plan to forcibly remove several pine trees around the lake. She'd lost that vote, and apparently she was petty enough to concoct any excuse to make my life miserable. "You need to lower your volume after 10 p.m., she demanded. "Otherwise, further action will be taken." I stared at her in disbelief, wondering if she had any clue how ridiculous she sounded, but Beverly's unrelenting glare told me she believed every word she was spewing. Feeling the anger bubble in my chest, I declared that I was done entertaining such nonsense and stormed off, determined to find out if the law would actually support something this asinine. That evening, I called my longtime friend Mark, who happened to be a defense attorney, and explained the entire bizarre scenario to him in detail. After a stunned silence, he burst out laughing for a good minute, then assured me that no legitimate court would uphold a fine for excessive breathing. However, when he discovered that Beverly had attached decibel readings and was apparently recording me without my permission, he suggested there might be grounds for a harassment or privacy lawsuit. Over the next few days, Mark dug into the HOA bylaws and found no legitimate mention of respiratory volume or anything resembling the new rule Beverly had unilaterally imposed. He also found out that the decibel meter contraption was installed on common property only after Beverly had personally authorized a spending measure for noise control devices, which had never been put to a community vote. Realizing I had a strong case, Mark encouraged me to file a formal complaint against the HOA for overreach, along with a cease and desist letter aimed at Beverly for unauthorized surveillance. While I was hesitant at first, the next letter that arrived, listing my first offense and demanding immediate payment of $150, pushed me over the edge. The nerve of that woman to timestamp my so-called breathing violation at 11:15 p.m. was comical, as though she had stood outside my window with a stopwatch counting each inhale and exhale. That same day, I sent back a response through Mark's legal office, refusing payment on the grounds that the fine was baseless and the rule was unconstitutional. Of course, Beverly retaliated with more petty notices, claiming she had video evidence of me snoring above acceptable volume, which was not only laughable, but also a grotesque invasion of privacy. By that point, I was so enraged at her brazen intrusions that I decided to go full throttle with a lawsuit, accusing her of harassment, illegal surveillance, and emotional distress. Mark drafted the complaint in excruciating detail, explaining how her personal vendetta led her to create this ridiculous rule and how her continuous attempts at enforcement were nothing short of bullying. Meanwhile, I started receiving texts and calls from curious neighbors, some half-jokingly asking if I really had a rare condition causing me to breathe like a horse, others who were outright disgusted with Beverly's overreach. I spent a few nights emailing copies of the insane letters to the neighbors who asked for proof, and they were all appalled that the HOA had stooped to such depths. At our next monthly meeting, Beverly tried to keep me out on the grounds that I was disturbing the peace, but I forced my way in, brandishing the complaint papers in my hand. Her face turned beet red when I announced that I had officially filed a lawsuit against the HOA itself, as well as her personally, and that she would be hearing from my attorney. There was a collective gasp in the room, followed by a stunned silence, and I could see her carefully crafted veneer of calm authority begin to crack. She sputtered something about me destroying the community with frivolous lawsuits, but I simply retorted that she was the one who took an oath to uphold her property rights, and now she was weaponizing the rules for her own personal agenda. Before leaving the meeting, I made a public statement about how I believed in maintaining a safe and pleasant neighborhood, but not at the cost of basic personal freedoms like breathing. A few people actually clapped, and I overheard them whisper that they'd never liked Beverly's tyrannical tendencies. Walking out of that meeting, I felt an odd mixture of anger and relief, knowing I'd finally taken a stand against something so unbelievably stupid yet so disturbingly invasive. Over the next week, tensions ran high, with Beverly doubling down on fear-mongering emails about how my belligerence was bringing the community into disrepute, while I calmly prepared the evidence with Mark. We gathered depositions from neighbors who had also been victims of her petty fines, like the elderly widow who got a citation for her wind chimes being too loud and offensive. Each story, combined with my own, painted a portrait of an out-of-control HOA that had lost sight of its actual responsibilities. The media even caught wind of the bizarre excessive breathing fine, and a local reporter reached out, asking for an on-camera interview, which I agreed to, figuring sunlight was the best disinfectant. Once the lawsuit was officially in motion, Beverly tried to backpedal, claiming the rule was never meant to be enforced so severely, but Mark shut that nonsense down by citing her official notices. As we inched closer to the preliminary hearing, I felt a wave of nerves and adrenaline, but also an unwavering conviction that no judge with half a brain would side with this ridiculous attempt at controlling personal bodily functions. The day I walked into the courthouse, I took a deep breath, loudly, just to remind myself that I had the right to breathe, no matter what Beverly's totalitarian fantasies dictated.